Okay, let's see. Make sure I'm set up here. Okay, I'll get moving in just a minute. Before I actually start with the lab, one student had a request that I go over the sometimes strange grouping behavior of dplyr when you use group by, especially with multiple variables. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. But I'll start with that once a few more people get in. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions?
This might sound like I wasn't in class for the whole time last time, and you might have answered this already, but do we have class on Wednesday, or is that?
No, I just sent out an email earlier. If you didn't see, yeah, no, it's Veterans Day, so there's nothing on Wednesday. So as a result, our class does actually only have 10 lectures for the term. Instead, it would have 11 if we didn't have Veterans Day. But now we've got Wednesday off, so it has no real impact. It just means you don't have to start on homework 6 until the following week, unless you want to get an early jump on it. We've actually covered the necessary stuff to start with 6 if you want, but don't have to. Anything else? Okay, so I'll talk just really briefly about grouping behavior here. So actually, I think the person who requested isn't even in chat yet, but I don't want to get moving. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load up my basic packages. As an example, I will use be good data for grouping on. You guys get to work with. Okay, empty cars it is. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show, if I say empty cars, group by, say, cylinder, the number of cylinders in the motors of these cars, and I say like summarize average MPG equals mean of MPG. If I do this, what you're going to see is it's going to say as sort of a message here, summarize ungrouping output, override with .groups argument here. What this is actually saying is that I grouped on cylinder, but because I aggregated and summarized my data, it automatically ungrouped it. The reason for that is because I'm grouped on cylinder here. The resulting data frame only has one row per level of cylinder, so it doesn't make any sense to keep it grouped anymore, right? Yeah, there'd be nothing to group within. You'd just be grouping on single levels of cylinder, okay? So it's actually telling us it's ungrouping it. The thing is, though, is if instead of grouping on cylinder, I group on, let's say, automatic transmission and cylinder, I do the same thing. It's now going to say summarize regrouping output by AM. So what it's done here is it's taken the empty car's data and it's grouped it by every unique combination of AM and cylinder. And when it summarizes it, what it actually results in is data still grouped on AM, the first one of those groups. So 000111 here, this is AM, but it's not grouped on levels of cylinder because there are now multiple rows per level of AM, but there's only one row within each one of those groups for each one of the cylinders. So it's decided that the data should stay grouped by the one that still has multiple rows. If you're not expecting your resulting data to be grouped, you want to manually ungroup your data is one option you'd have. You do that, the resulting data would no longer be grouped. You'll see here, the result of this empty cars output says groups are AM and there's 2 groups. If I use the ungroup function, it no longer has that line about groups. So tables like this actually tell you how they're grouped. It's just subtle because it's this little gray thing that's really easy to miss. Okay, but they're sort of like it preserves some grouping. Another thing that you can do is in summarize, you could do dot groups, and I actually forget what argument you give to dot groups. Summarize dot groups. Drop, all levels of grouping are dropped. So you could do this. It would pop out and be ungrouped as a result. You see there's no little row here saying how we're grouped. Or you could say keep, and it would actually keep both original grouping levels. So there's some little fancy shit you can add in there. Oh, so can I make the font bigger again? Yeah, I actually did, but I'll boost it a little bit higher. Think about the max I can handle in front of me is about 13 or 14. That might be a little bit better. Let's see if we can go to 14 without me going insane. I can handle that. Okay. It's just when you have text that's big, like to me right now, the text on the screen with a giant monitor in front of me is just like these giant letters. It's like it's like sitting 8 inches away from a big screen TV. Okay, but I can deal with that. Okay, so that's it. Anyone have any questions about like grouping or any of that? The consequences of it can be kind of annoying. If you forget you have group data, you perform some operation, it'll be grouped within that. Another thing is if you group and instead I do like a mutate command like this, the resulting data will still be fully grouped by whatever you did up here. If you're not expecting that, you'll want to manually ungroup. I usually manually ungroup after anything just because I tend to forget I've grouped my data. Okay, so that's all I have on that. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get rolling on this homework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the posted template here. So I'm just going to come in here and under week 6, going to come down to homework 5, part 2. The part 2 markdown template, if you kind of might be probably way too small to see, honestly. This is just the part 1 key for the part 1 homework. So I'm just going to download this, put it in this ignore, pop it open and start with this. Okay. Let's make sure this all runs. Okay. Let's just run everything down to there. Okay. That puts us right. Okay, that's good. Okay, so we'll be starting this homework. You should have a data frame that looks kind of like this with the turnout rates. You should have something that's essentially 1 row per precinct. In the data, you have the location, Seattle or not Seattle, a column for registered voters. You may or may not have this times counted column and a turnout column, or what really matters, sort of the registered voters and turnout. And you should have this data set that we made it with, which is you can call it whatever you want, but this is sort of the original data set of just the governor, lieutenant governor, and president's races, which I can't remember if King Flag is what I called it in the actual lab, but you should have something essentially like that. Okay. And if you don't, I would recommend downloading the template and working off of the template. Okay, so if we've got that, let's take a look at part 2. So what we want to get for part 2, right, which I sort of mentioned as we're further up in the homework, is that we want to get measures of Democratic support in each precinct for each of our 3 races. Our 3 races being the president's race, the governor's race, and the lieutenant governor's race. So we're going to measure support as the percentage of votes in a given precinct for the Democratic candidate out of all the votes for actual candidates, including write-ins, but we're not going to include blank votes or overvotes, okay? Because those are sort of like invalid votes. Okay. So the idea here is that our denominator here is not going to be like the sum of count variable we used before, but we're instead going to have to come to a slightly different denominator that excludes some of these invalid but actually cast votes. Okay. So I suggest here that one good approach would be to compute the total votes as a denominator for each precinct and then merge it back onto the Democratic vote count for each of those races and then divide by the total votes. Okay, it's one easy way to go about doing that. Okay, you could follow some sort of a process like this. I suggest you may make a new data frame with a total number of votes cast, including write-ins for each precinct and race, using filter, group by, summarize, sum account, then make another data frame with a total number of votes for each Democratic candidate in each precinct and race. And an important thing here is that you're going to want to check party of candidates and figure out which ones are the Democratic observations. The tricky thing here is that there are multiple Democratic parties, which we'll get to here in a second. Okay. So just to make it clear where we're at, I'm going to grab this and put it up here and sort of start working our way down. Okay. So if I wanted to get an idea of what were, say, the valid parties for the different candidates in these races, anybody have an idea how I might go about figuring that out? So if my data look like something like that, if I just want to get the sort of legitimate value, see how they line up with individual candidates, what might I do? You can kind of see them here. What columns would I care about? Counter type. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. If I do here king flag count counter type, I get sort of the candidates people might vote for, and I get a count of them. But here I don't see the political party. If I want the political party, what should I tag on? That was a good reaction face. There we go. Yeah, right. Okay. So getting here a little late. King flag is just the name of the sort of data set that's filtered down to the president's governor's race and the lieutenant governor's race that we made up in the top. In lab, I may have called it something different like king races, but I'm using the answer key here as a start just to make sure everybody's on the same page if they use that. So as a reference, king flag is something that looks basically like this. You should have like Adair, the precinct, the governor's race, a bunch of different rows for governor, lieutenant governor, and so on, which correspond to the candidates they could vote for, but also crap like registered voters, blank votes, write-ins, and all that. Okay, but if I go count party counter type here, what we're going to see is that essentially we have things like Daryl Castle and Scott Bradley, CPN. No idea what party that is, but it's probably some kind of party. Now you'll see here that if you remember the 2016 races, and including the 2020 race, Jay Inslee is the state Democratic governor candidate. We see over here that he's attached to the Dem Party, and similarly, Cyrus Habib here is attached to Democratic Party. But notice here for the presidential race that we get something a little bit different. For Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine, the party over here is DPN instead of Dem. Okay, so the idea is that this Dem here, this is the state Democratic Party. This is Democratic Party National. So if you're not familiar with the sort of structure of parties like the parties in the United States, the state party and the national party are not the same entity. So these are actually sort of signifying that it's different parties. Welcome to these data, right? Okay, so what we're going to want to do, right, is we want to get the Democratic candidates, whether they are for governor here, lieutenant governor, or president and vice president. Okay, so if I wanted to filter my data down, well, actually, we're not going to filter down to Democrat yet, actually. What we want to do is we want to filter down first to legitimate votes for these different candidates, okay? So basically we need to know about this party thing, but we're going to use it in a minute. Okay, so if I go back to my king flag data, to return to this thing up here, to make a new data frame with a total number of votes cast for any actual candidates, including write-in, okay? Using this information here, sort of like, so this is a legitimate candidate, right? Okay, this looks like a legitimate candidate. This looks like a legitimate candidate. What here does not look like a legitimate candidate for in office? Yeah, that's one, times blank voted. This is not a legitimate candidate. In fact, I specifically said times blank voted, right, is one we don't want. Times counted, times overvoted, right? All these ones are not things that are legitimate candidates. Well, what here do you see on the screen distinguishes the legitimate candidates for the illegitimate candidates? Right? You'll see that basically, but not quite, every one of the sort of not legitimate candidates in here has a party of NP. Well, NP, what do you think that is? Yeah, non-party or no party, right? There isn't a party because they're not actual candidates. There is one exception for something important we want to keep. Notice here that write-in also has no party attached to it. So if I want to filter my data down to every legitimate candidate, so starting with king flag here, how could I use filter to get down to only the legitimate rows here? So first, what do I not want in general? Oh, that's another kind of fun one, is you could say that there's 2,517 rows for legitimates. The problem is that write-in right here is also a 7551, and we want to keep it. The reason for that is that there's 2,517 valid precinct observations, but we have 3 races, so this is 2,517 times 3 because they're repeated if we're going to the races. Yeah, so we don't want NP. So how would I remove, or I just kind of gave away the command to do it, how would I remove in a filter statement rows where party is NP? So what do I want to say? So if I say filter party equals NP, what's that going to give me? So the next one down here is the inversion of that. So if I do filter party equals NP, yeah, filter on object party, not it's capital B. Okay. So if I do that, I'm going to get only the party equals NP. So what we want is the inversion of this. Party does not equal NP. And then what we're going to get down here, you'll see, is for the governor's race, I have 2 rows for governor, the Dem and Republican candidates, which are Jay Inslee and Bill Bryant. And otherwise, I have all the legitimate candidates for all these different races. Okay. So if I want to get all the ones that are not party, but I want to keep my write-ins, what might I be able to add to this? What would be a statement that would check and still give me a true when it's a write-in? How did I get the not symbol? This is a thing called a ligature. If I write exclamation point and equals like this and remove the space between them, on my screen, they're going to get converted into that. It's called a ligature. You can turn them on in your options, but it's just an exclamation point and equals. Yeah, sorry for that. This is the disadvantage of teaching on my home computer instead of the lab computer, is my computer is customized and it's really annoying to turn these things off every time. So sometimes I get something like this that's confusing. Similarly, my rainbow brackets might confuse. Okay, so if what I also want is I want to keep all the things where party is not NP, but I also want to keep the things where it's where there's a write-in. What might I add to this? Or I might ask, how would I just keep the write-ins? Because I can make an entirely different filter statement. Okay, so is it party? It's almost there. Counter type. So if I do another statement that is counter type equals write in, is it write in or is it edit? I think it's write dash in. That'll do. Okay, so it's write in. How could I make it and stitch this statement and this statement together into a single filter? So logically speaking, how would you just verbally or whatever say exactly what we want, right? Would it be and is the question here. We might say, I'd like to take my data and then filter so that party is not NP and counter type is write in. Would that be what we'd say? Because do we want the observations where it's not NP, but it's simultaneously also write in? Or do we want something slightly different? Because an and requires both to be true at the same time. Are there any observations where party is not equal to NP and counter type is equal to write in? The answer is no, because anytime counter type is write in, the party is equal to NP. So what should I use instead of and? No, %in doesn't help us here, but vertical bar does. Vertical bar is or. So what this says is I want every row where party is not equal to NP, but I will also accept rows where counter type is write in at the same time as it's NP. Because this statement over here would be for write-ins. This will be false, but this one will be true. And for an or, as long as one side of this is true, it's going to return a true. The resulting data frame for this is going to have, for instance, 3 rows for governor, 3 for lieutenant governor, which are going to have Jay Inslee, write-in, Bill Bryant, Cyrus Beebe, write-in, Marty McClendon. This is exactly what we want. So we essentially need this sort of joint filter statement that gets us exactly what we want. Any questions about that?
I have a question. So why is it that it doesn't return only write-ins on that, or I guess like selecting only rows with write-in, and it still selects the ones that are not write-in?
I'll do a demonstration. So let's say that we have data frame where x is equal to, let's go 1 to 3, y is equal to letters 1 to 3. So we have a little data frame that looks like this, like 1, 2, 3, A, B, C. I say filter such that x is equal to 1 and let's say y is equal to A, I'm going to get that first row, right? Because it's going to go and look and say x is 1, y is A. These both have to be true at the same time to return what I'm asking for. So it's going to give me that first row, right? Show it again. But if I say, and x is equal to 1 and y is equal to B, it's never going to be true because there is no single row where x can be equal to 1 and y equal to B at the same time. However, if I flip this to or, what or is saying is that as long as either one of these statements or both are true, it'll give me the row. So x is equal to 1 here. X is equal to 1 for this one, but y is not equal to B. Here, x is not equal to 1, but y is equal to B, so it gives me both of them. If I say and here, they're never simultaneously true, and it gives me nothing. Does that make sense?
So it's kind of like if you were to look into put everything in a Venn diagram, the and
Yes.
just be like where they overlap, and the or would be the entirety of the 2 circles.
That is an excellent illustration. And if I think about it, I'll make a picture for that to add to my filter statements for my spring version of this class, because I actually haven't thought about doing that. It's a much better way to illustrate it than verbally. Okay. Yeah. So get rid of that. So now what we got down is we got that. This gives us all of our valid votes. Okay. So the next thing that we want to do is I want to get the sort of, I'm going to actually assign this to something. Let's call this candidate vote rows. That will just kind of keep everything that we want. God, the heat in my house just turned on. This is going to be real fun. I don't know about you, when you folks are teaching sections or classes or anything like that, but you just like heat up rapidly and become drenched in sweat. It's rapidly turning to be like 80 degrees in here. I'm just going to, of course, I just took a shower and now I'm taking a second shower apparently. Okay. So anyway, what I want to do is I want to summarize this, giving them away. I want to aggregate my data down to the rows or to a single precinct row observation that will be just the count of the sort of total votes for candidates. Okay. So if I have my candidate vote rows, which look like this, how might I reduce these data down so that I have one row per precinct and race instead of 3, for instance, governor ones for a day or 3 lieutenant governor and just a boatload over here of president ones? How could I summarize this down to be 1 row per precinct race within the sum of the total number of votes counted? What would I want to do as my first sort of statement here to set this up? It's usually the first step in aggregating some data. Yeah, I like that. Let's group by. Most specifically, let us group by the precinct, except I'm typing this. I have no idea where that's going. Okay, let's group by the precinct and the race. So this just sets us up. So it's going to say, okay, I'm going to do some aggregation and I'm going to reduce it down to unique observations of precinct and race. Okay. So here's the question. Thought we're looking at only King County, not all precincts. Yes, we are technically looking at King County, but in this case, that is every precinct because these are King County exclusive data. So it is all of them. Or you're saying at King County in the aggregate?
No, that's what I meant. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So candidate vote rows, we're going to group by precinct and race. So now if what I want to do is create a variable that will essentially just sum up all of the number of votes within each one of these precincts and races. How might I do something like that? I want to have my data be reduced to 1 row per precinct race. What command do we normally use for this, for aggregation? We could with mutate, kind of, but it wouldn't reduce the number of rows we have. Summarize is basically a mutate, but it also reduces down to 1 row per combination of things in your group by. Mutate and summarize are very similar. Mutate just doesn't reduce the number of rows. So in this case, I'm going to stick to my American spelling here. Going to Oxford in the summer for a postdoc, and I'm going to take my American spelling with me. Okay, summarize. And then if we want to summarize and we want to get the total number of votes, what sort of statement would give me the total votes within that precinct and race? What aggregation command would I use inside summarize? Oh, I like the look of that. So here's an example of going to go with the total votes. We're going to say total votes are going to be equal to the sum of count. So, right, this, for instance, is a single precinct race sort of set of rows. So what this is going to say is my total votes cast are equal to the sum of count, which is going to be 256 plus that one rebel who wanted to do a write-in plus 224. Okay. So if we run this, we should get a total votes column, which is equal to 481, which was the sum of those 3 numbers we had before. We now have, for instance, for Adair, only 3 rows, 1 for each one of the races, Aldara, 1 for each of the races. In fact, no matter what, as long as anybody cast a vote for a given race, we should have 1 row for each precinct race combination. Okay. I'm then going to call this total candidate votes. Assign that over there. You'll notice here, summarize, regrouping output by precinct. Remember that thing I said about grouping before? If I didn't want this group this way, what might I want to do to this? For safety, I often like to do this. Just because inevitably I will forget it is grouped and then do something weird later, and it will take me 5 minutes to figure out why it's breaking. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to ungroup it here at the end. We'll have total candidate votes that looks like this. Okay. So good start. So the next thing we want to do, right? We have the total candidate votes. But the next thing we want, and I'm pretty sure this is the next one here, is make another data frame with a total number of votes exclusively for Democratic candidates in each precinct and race. Okay, so I'm going to open up a new little chunk here. Okay, so if I want to get down to the votes that are specific for Democratic candidates, oh yeah, sorry there, Sam. Yeah, you missed the ungroup talk. You can revisit it, however, at the start of the video. Basically, the gist of it is stick ungroup at the end of things after you do like summarize and stuff. Usually it takes care of it. And whenever you do a grouped statement like this, it will usually, it's doing there right there. Oh, it's suppressing it now. Oh, sure, be that way. Okay. Yeah, normally it's going to do something like this and tell you how it's regrouping the output. If you see that, it knows it did something. Yeah. Okay, anyway, so if we want to go back to our, for instance, we could take our candidate vote rows that look like this, right? These have already been filtered down such that we have our Democrat, like Republican, and then our write-in votes here. If I wanted to take this data frame and filter it down to only Democratic candidates, how might I go about doing that? So based on the sort of available information we have in this, how do you think we might do it? You can begin with what function I might use to get down to those rows.
Party.
Party. We can do that, and we can use filter, teamwork. Okay, so if I want to filter and use party, what parties do I want to get the Democratic Party? Ah, here we go. I like it. We're close on target. So here, he's suggesting we use %in. The reason we're going to use %in is there's multiple parties that we are okay with using. There's one slight tweak we need to make to this. If I say C Dem DPN, what is R going to get upset about? Yes, that's the one tricky thing. If I write this, it's going to say object dem not found. Okay, so this is one of those things that's a useful experience to show sort of reading error messages. So here it's saying, okay, when you pop up an error message, often your instinct, especially when you're newer to R, is going to be to not like fully read and really work at trying to understand what the error message says. But I urge you to resist that, to instead read them carefully and see if you can pull out any kind of useful information from them. If we look at this, it says error, problem with filter, input ... 1. This is just saying that there's a problem in our filter function we ran, specifically in its first input. Okay, so its first input thing is our filter statement. We're only giving it one input. It says X object dem not found. Input 1 is party this. Well, what this is actually doing is giving us a lot of useful information. It's saying there's an error in its first input. This right here is its first input. And in this first input, it can't find this dem thing, okay? What tells you, when you see something like object something not found, it means you haven't made that object yet, but more often it means you accidentally forgot to quote something. So we say dem, we see DPN, we're still almost there. If we run this, we don't get any error. but we do not exactly get what we want. And that was the other fix that's in the chat, is that because R is a case-sensitive language, dem and dem are not equivalent. This gives us exactly what we want. So we have dem party, dem, DPN. You'll notice we're going to end up with, because there's only one Democratic candidate for any given race, always, because these don't include primaries, we're going to have a DARE, governor, lieutenant governor, US vice president. We're going to get 3 rows per precinct. It's just going to have our Democratic candidates, and it handles the fact that they have different names for their party. Okay, so here's a question. Is there a shortcut used to put quotes around the values? It's not really a shortcut. So I double click to highlight a single object. So double clicking will put your highlights around something. Just hit quotes and it will throw quotes around things. One of those little RStudio things that it saves you a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now we're down to exclusively our Democratic rows. Okay. So this is basically what we want. Okay. So the thing is, though, is that what I would like to do here is, and this is sort of a good practice, we know we're going to be joining some data onto this. We're going to join our total votes onto this. If I'm going to join another data frame on, or going to be joining stuff, I tend to like to discard all the useless columns in the data frame before I do that. Let's trim it down to the stuff that we actually want. So if all I care about essentially is getting matching my precincts and my races together, getting my Democratic votes matched onto the total votes, and I probably will care about where these things are. What would I want to keep in this particular data frame? What things first are necessary to join this to my existing data on the total number of votes? I like that so far. Let's select precinct and race are the ones that are necessary for making the join. The next is we want the number of votes. But here's the thing. In this data frame right here, the candidate vote rows, if I show you this, what is the name for the votes we have here? So it's some account. The thing is, though, is that it's not really exactly some account anymore. I would say that I want to just call this maybe the Democratic votes. So what I can say here is I want some account. I'm going to go over here and say, let's rename it at the same time. Make it clear that that column isn't the old sum account column, but instead a new column that's exclusively our Democratic votes. Okay. Now I'm not going to include party here. The reason I'm not going to include party here is we already specifically know these votes are already only for the Democratic candidates. I'm not too worried about the specific parties. I just use that to get the appropriate rows. I'm going to leave them out. And there's one other thing that at this point in the homework, you wouldn't necessarily know exactly what you want to keep. You'd have to go back and grab it again, is let's keep our, whether it's in Seattle or not in the Seattle column. Okay. Otherwise, I think that's about all we really need. If I do this, we get a nice clean data frame. It has the precinct and the race, which are required to uniquely identify each row of data. We have the number of Democratic votes, and then we still keep that location column that we had before. Okay. This will do the job as a minimum sort of data frame. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this Democratic vote rows. This is a nice, clean, simple data frame containing only rows for Democratic votes. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to merge this total votes data, total candidate votes, with the Democratic vote rows, and then calculate a % of Democratic votes variable for each race. Okay, so how am I going to go about doing something like that? I want to stick these two together. What might I do? Left join. That's a fair guess. The nice thing with a left join is that 90% of the time, if you want to join data, left join will probably do what you want it to do. So it doesn't matter in this case which one you start with. The thing about it is because they both come from the same data set, there aren't going to be any missings on either side of the data. It honestly doesn't matter which one you start with. I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's start with the Democrat votes. I usually like to start with the one that has more rows in it, right? No particular reason. You'll end up with the same result. So Democrat votes looks like this. Precinct, race, Dem votes, location. I'm going to say, take that, and let's left join it to, if we remember, total candidate votes. Looks like this. It's a precinct, a race, and a total votes. Okay. So what are we joining on here? What are the common identifiers between these two data frames? Precinct and race. So I have two options here. If you have nice, clean data frames like this that I've already trimmed the variables down, I don't actually have to tell it what I want to join on because I've already made it so that their only common columns are precinct and race. And then the resulting data will have put together the Dem votes from Democratic vote rows and location, and then total votes from the total candidate votes data frames. That's nice. But you could also specify this. I could say we want to join by precinct and race. And that just makes it kind of specific. Okay. I usually like to be specific about these things, but you don't have to. Okay. So next thing we want to do is if I want to calculate the percent of Democratic votes in each one of these races, what would be my next step? You can give me the function we do it in. I like the look of that. Yeah, we're going to mutate a new variable. I'm actually going to straight copy this. Let's go with so in this case, you've been consistently using the spaced variables. I've been inconsistently taking whatever people give me. So I think mine looks like that. But we'll do that. Okay. So what this is saying is we're going to mutate a new variable. We're going to create a variable called Dem support. It's going to be equal to the Dem votes column here, divided by the total votes column over here. If we run this, we should get something that looks kind of like a percentage and probably is hovering, you know, until we get to Seattle, vaguely around 50%. Okay. So looks to me like it gets basically what we want. Okay. And then all I actually care about here are, I don't actually care about the total number of votes cast or the total Democratic votes. So just to keep it clean, I'm going to say I want, should I be specific? Yeah, I'm just going to say, let's keep the precinct, let's keep the location, let's keep the race, and Dem support. Trim it down to the things we care about. Okay. And then I'm going to assign this to an object here. So give us some rates. Now, if I've calculated rates, they look like this. What might I want to check on this Dem support column over here to be sure that this did what we wanted it to do? What should rates look like? That is a good intuition to me. Rates, well, they probably ought to be between 0 and 1. So just really quickly, I'm going to say, let's take a look at this. Let's say one way to do this would be to pull out Dem support, do a quick summary of it. And we should see here that the minimum is 0. So somewhere there is a place that has 0 Dem votes. There are places where there's 100% of the votes are Democrat and there's 6 NAs. Some of these might look a little odd to me. Like we wouldn't really in a realistic place expect to see 0% or 100% unless there's really few people. So in a real sort of data environment, I would probably check on these things just for fun. I'm going to say, let's take a peek at these. Filter dem support is, let's say, greater than 95, or dem support is less than 5%. See what kind of rows we get. Looks like we get a fair number. We get a bunch with these 1.0s. We get some ones that are actually probably totally legitimate. Seattle precinct, 95% Democrat. Yeah, that's going to happen in Seattle. But for the most part, these don't look too crazy. These kind of like Cougar Mountain and Eagle ones, maybe there's like 5 people living in those places. We could actually check it against the registered voters if we wanted to. None of these look wildly like off target. One other thing I might say is let's check for which ones are missing. And we see here we get a bunch of NANs. Do you remember what generates an NAN? What sort of mathematical operation generates an NAN? Division by 0. Okay. So what does that mean about our statement up here if we ended up with a few rows that we divided by 0? So what has to be 0 up here, right? It means that we have some selection of precincts in our data that probably had total votes equal to 0. We might look into that if this is sort of a real thing that we were like, working on for research. You might do something like take total candidate votes here, and filter and see, are there places where total votes equal 0? And you're going to find, in fact, there's a limited number, 2 precincts in Seattle that actually don't have any votes cast in them at all. And so we got those numbers because we divided by 0 in these places. Okay. So these are sort of common things that, while they're not important for this homework, you probably want to do these sorts of checks when you're working with these sorts of data. Okay. Okay. So hopping on here, we got basically what we want right here. We can keep going. Okay. So now we've got this Democratic voting percentage, right? What we want to do is we want to put them back together with the precinct turnout rates that we had before. And then we're going to make sure that they're in the appropriate shape, the shape that I sort of recommended earlier, which is 1 row per precinct with columns for each of the relevant measures. Yeah, we're actually going to move between wide and long data for this once or twice, but that's basically what we want. Okay, so let's take a peek quickly at what our turnout rates data frame looks like. It should have been left over from the end of the previous homework. We have something that looks like this. We have precinct, location, registered voters, times counted over here, and we have turnout. Okay. If I want to join this to our existing data, our data being the Democratic vote rates, which looks like this, what should I do? Oh, I like that. Pivot wider and then inner join. Yeah, we could do it either way, but I kind of like the idea of starting with the pivot. So I assume for that, you probably mean to begin with the Democratic vote rates data frame. Because the Democratic vote rates one, right, is the one that has 3 rows per precinct because it's got 1 per race, right? So this was something that makes sense to pivot out wider. So we could say here, let's take our Democratic vote rates. Now, if I want to take a data frame like this, take a data frame like this, and I want to say we're going to go through from having 3 rows per precinct, 1 sort of observation per race over here with its value here, to instead having columns that are separate for governor, lieutenant governor, and vice president that contain these percentage of votes. What kind of syntax would I want to do for that? Does anybody remember the pivot wider syntax? It's fine not to. We only used it a few times. So there's two components we're working with. We're going to convert one column into new column names. Yes, there we go. So we're going to say we're going to take new column names from somewhere. Where are our column names coming from? What's going to be the new column names? Yeah, I like that. So we're going to end up with new columns from race. So we're going to get a governor column, a lieutenant governor, and a US president, vice president column. And then we got some values from, and values are coming from where? I like the look of that, especially with the backticks. So we're going to pull it from dem sport. I'm so lazy, I won't type the backticks. I'll just start typing dem and hit tab, but we can do that too. So what this is going to say is we'll get 3 new columns because there's 3 unique values of race, and the dem support values will be in. If I do that, I get a new data frame with 1 row per precinct, and a governor, lieutenant governor, and US president and vice president column. Okay. Then to follow up with what Courtney was saying before, yes, is then we can toss on an inner join to this with our turnout routes here. Technically speaking, I probably shouldn't have to do anything other than this to get what we want. We still see we have 1 row per precinct, but we have a location, a governor's race percentage, lieutenant governor's race percentage, US president, vice president, but we also have the registered voters, the total number of votes cast, and the turnout rate for that precinct. This right here is the data frame that I said we would end up with essentially at the end of this homework. We have 1 row per precinct. We have columns for the Democratic vote for each one of our races. We still have registered voters and turnout. Looks nice to me. Now I need to assign this to, let's just call this like, this is our essentially our final precinct data. It's like that. So can you specify where we're using the inner join? I'm not sure for Courtney's specific reason for picking inner join, but the answer is all of them will produce the exact same result. So left join, right join, and inner join will all do the same thing here. So the only difference between left join, right join, and inner join is how it behaves when there's missing data on columns that we're joining on, basically. And in this case, there's absolutely nothing missing. Every single precinct race combination is observed in both data sets. So inner join, left join, and right join will all give us exactly the same thing. And I tend to find that usually if somebody's instinct is to go with inner join, they probably had some prior SQL training or something else, because that usually would be the sort of default slightly filtering join that people would typically use. I sort of default to using either inner join or left join myself. Okay. So any other questions on that front? Or if that was not clear, you can ask for another one clarification. Okay, great. I always like to check. Sometimes just gibberish flows out of my mouth and you never really know where it's going. Okay, so what we've got here is, run over precinct, column for each of the relevant measures. Each one, pivot wider. Yep, okay, we are good. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we're going to do some graphing of this, okay? So here I say we're going to make a scatter plot where the horizontal axis is the number of registered voters, the precinct vertical axis is the turnout rate. I want to color it by precincts in Seattle versus those not in Seattle, okay? So how would I go about making a plot of this? How would I build this up? Make a scatter plot. What's the foundation of all plots that I've shown you in this class? Let us begin with the GG plot. I'm going to say it's a GG plot. Okay. What is usually the first argument you give inside of a GG plot? It's the data. What's our data in this case? Yeah. Using data. And then, as the next person said, we're going to give it an AES. So we have an X equals, and we have a Y equals. So what is my X equals here? If I want on my horizontal axis, the number of registered voters, I like what's in chat there. I'm going to say registered voters. And then I'm going to put over here the turnout. In this case, I don't need the backticks on turnout over here because it doesn't have any spaces in it. Doesn't hurt anything if you put backticks on it, but I'll do almost anything to get out of hitting one more key, especially the one up there. My pinky doesn't like reaching that high. It's uncomfortable. Okay, so next thing is I've got sort of a basis for my plot. If I hit this, I'm going to get a blank slate for us to gloriously apply things to. So if I want to make a scatter plot, what would I add to our blank slate? I like it. I also like geom something. I feel like I should write a package that just has like geom something in there. Just so I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, and have it like auto pick, just like randomly picks one. So geom, and I literally typed it without thinking. Okay, geom point. Okay, so this is going to give us a scatter plot of these. It's going to say I got a couple rows with missing values, and some of our missing values remaining from earlier. Okay, so we have registered voters and we have turnout. If I want to make it so the points are also, if I want to make it so the points are also colored by whether they're in Seattle or not, what should I add up in here? And where? I like color equals location. Where should I put it? Yeah, I like that. Color equals location. We're getting a little long here, so just in the interests of formatting, I'm going to break it out like that. And now we have observations in Seattle, observations not in Seattle. X-axis is registered voters, Y-axis is the turnout. Okay, so yeah, we got something. And this sort of plot would also sort of help us visualize maybe some other things that are sort of interesting and going on. You might notice that there's something a little odd about places that have, for instance, basically no registered voters and having valid like sort of turnout rates. It's kind of funny to have something like this is basically straddling 0 over here. Maybe it's a couple things, but you also have at least 1 or 2 observations here that are like hovering way down here. You might check on some of these weird ones that are way out like that. But in general, if you look at something like this, what does this look like for turnout rates? There's like a cloud of points up here high and kind of a cloud that's a little bit lower. How might you characterize voting patterns between Seattle and not Seattle? Yeah, kind of looks like glancing at it, assuming there's not something odd and misleading about this, it looks like the Seattle precincts tend to have a higher voter turnout rate, or at least had a higher voter turnout rate in 2016. Okay, it's kind of an interesting thing. If you wanted to say tack on something to sort of get an idea if this is true or not, I might say something like, draw a smooth line on this. Adding the geom smooth is going to draw one little smoothing line for each level of the colors. And so we tax on here, we have a smooth line showing sort of the average turnout rate is generally just higher in Seattle, a little lower in not Seattle. And overall, there's sort of a weak relationship, it looks like, between registered voters and turnout. It looks like dead flat outside of Seattle, And if anything, it looks a little higher turnout rate in lower numbers of registered voters, which if you know anything about sort of voting behavior in like urban areas, it shouldn't surprise because voting rates tend to be higher in more affluent places, which have lower densities. Okay, so sort of like a nice simple one. In your actual homework, I'd say dress it up with a nice title and a label, but this is just the gist of it. Your plot should look something like this. Okay. Questions about that? One of the best things about using the nice spaced and capitalized variable names, as was suggested, is that I don't have to modify them, so the axes already look nice in our plots. So you go non-lazy people. Okay. So next one. Actually, there we go. Okay, so the next one we want to do here is let's visualize the Democratic support rates for the three races within each precinct. I'm saying here for sufficiently large precincts. That is, we're going to limit data to precincts with at least 500 registered voters. That is, it's going to be all the precincts over here, but not the precincts over here. So we're actually going to cut out a lot of the data. This is sort of an arbitrary thing to do, but it has a higher stability because there's more voters. So we might limit down to smaller precincts. We're going to make a line plot where the horizontal axis is the precincts. Okay, the y-axis is going to be Democratic support. So I say here it's going to be important to not label the precincts on the horizontal axis. Okay, so we have what, like 2,500 precincts. What do you think is going to happen if we label our x-axis and we plot precincts on the x-axis? I'll show you in a minute, but just intuitively, what do you think might happen? So it's a categorical variable. What happens when you plot categorical variables on an axis? Lots of labels is the correct answer. Okay. We would end up with, if we had all 2,500 precincts, we would have 2,500 named labels on that axis, which might actually take your computer a while to draw. So slightly annoying. So if you work with categorical, lots of categorical data like we're going to do now, you probably want to suppress them. Another thing you want to do is make sure it does not draw the legend. Okay, so we'll get there. What we do want to do, though, is we want to put our categorical variable in a meaningful order. So what we're going to do is we're going to rearrange that categorical x-axis, that is the precinct name, from smallest to largest in terms of Democrat candidate for president support. Okay, so we're going to take these things sort of step by step, but we'll get there. And then sort of to do all this, I say we're going to want to use the wide version of the data, 1 row per precinct, and then we're probably going to, after that, pivot it down longer because we want to rearrange our factor levels of our precinct. We need to do this in wide form first. Okay, so let's do these step by step. So if I have my, what is the name of my data here? Precinct. Okay. If I got my precinct data look like this. If I want to filter down to only my smaller precincts, what's my first step? Just kind of running these in order. I like the look of that. Take my precinct data and then filter such that registered voters is greater than or equal to 500. I run that. We should see down here, all of my registered voter counts should be above 500. These all look above 500 to me. So we've gotten down to 500. Okay, so that's easy. The next thing we want to do is slightly more complicated. So basically here, precinct here, what we want to do is we want to be able to make a plot such that if I put precinct on the x-axis, it's not in alphabetical order anymore. It's kind of hard for me to show what this looks like now. I guess I'll say something like, you don't need to do this. This is just an example. I'm going to show if I sample out 20 of these and I say precinct y equals governor. Okay. So this sort of begins to show you the problem with sort of a factor x-axis. So what is down here on the x-axis are different precincts. So you have things that are like these weird abbreviations, is like Bellevue something. You'll notice here that there's no meaningful order to this x-axis here. It's just alphabetical, right? So for our dots here kind of just randomly go up and down based on their Democratic support for the governor, but they're not meaningfully ordered. What I would like to do is rearrange this so that the precincts are ordered so that we have the lowest Democratic support on the left and the highest Democratic support on the right. So these dots sort of are in ascending order left to right. Does anyone remember us doing this back in week 5 in an example near the end of lecture? Does anyone remember how we did that? Even the name of the function or even the example we used. We used the reorder function. Does anyone remember what artist's music we were reordering? We were working with Jay-Z data. Okay, so we're going to use this reorder function. In fact, we're not going to use exactly reorder. It's a slightly different reorder function in the forcats package. Do you remember what it was exactly called? Works similarly to the reorder function in base R, but it's slightly different. Okay. So if we want to reorder a variable, do you remember what we're going to reorder it in? So if you're reordering a variable, what are you doing to a variable? So how do you modify a variable in R? Or how do you modify anything in R for that matter? What do you tend to do to it? So as factor, we'll get it into a factor and we'll get there. But if you're just going to modify a variable, so we're going to take precinct and we're going to just change it, how will we do that? Mutate. So mutate creates variables, and in R, when we want to modify a variable, we're actually going to overwrite it, much like we do with any other object in R. If you want to modify something, you're actually just overwriting it. You're basically deleting it and recreating a new version of it. So creating a new variable and modifying one are actually the same operation. We're going to mutate, we're going to modify precinct, and we're going to say precinct is going to be the result of reordering this factor. So I say up here, what we might want to use is in the forcats package, FCT reorder. This is a little different from the base R reorder one. It's got a little bit better syntax. So if I've loaded the tidyverse, forcats will already be loaded. So I can say, I think I've already loaded tidyverse. I'm actually going to scroll to the top and check. Nope, I specifically loaded forcats in here, so I don't need to do it again. Okay. If you haven't loaded forcats yet, you can load forcats, or as in all other situations, if you're going to use like one function out of a package and you don't want to load the whole thing, you can do this syntax I have here. This says, go into the forcats package. Inside of that package, find the FCT reorder function. This is a nice little shortcut for getting things out of a package you really don't want to load. One of the most common packages for this, which you probably use in your stats classes, is the package mass, M-A-S-S. Don't load this fucking package. This package will overwrite many of your key dplyr functions, especially select, and just make you very upset later in it. Instead, you say things like mass glm.nb to your negative binomial models and things like that, or maybe mass MVR norm to do your simulations. Don't load the whole package. Okay. So anyway, we're going to reorder this factor. So the syntax for FCT reorder, we don't remember it, and I wouldn't expect you to. You might do help FCT reorder. I look over here, and like many R functions, it does not have an intuitive help page. It says FCT reorder takes .f, .x, .fun, some periods, and .desc. You're like, this has helped me in no way. So you might look in these and be like, what does this do? So it says FCT reorder takes a factor or character vector. In this case, precinct, if we look at it right here, it's a character vector. We don't have to convert it to a factor first. So it'll take a factor or character vector. And then it says the levels of f are reordered so that the values of function of .x are in ascending order. Okay. So if we want to reorder the precinct variable by democratic support for the president, how might I write this? Well, we would look at this and say, the thing we want to reorder is this factor. So what do I want to reorder? Yeah, we're going to reorder precinct. What do we want to reorder it by? So the second argument is the thing we're going to reorder it by. What are we reordering it by? Don't have to type the whole thing out. President, right? The annoying thing is that it's named this entire thing, but at least I can copy paste out of here. So we're going to say we're going to reorder it by this big factor, US President and Vice President. And by default, it's going to arrange them in ascending order. And I'm okay with that. So if we say reorder precinct by US President and Vice President, now I'll show you right here, if we do this, it will do apparently nothing to our data. You'll notice that it still says Adair, Aldara, Alder Springs, all these the same order it was in. But if we say arrange it by precinct, notice the first one is no longer Adair. It's now Nathan, which happens to have the lowest US President and Vice President Democratic vote of all of the data that we have at 30% for our larger districts. So what we've done is we reordered the factor levels so they no longer arrange by their alphabetical order, they arrange by their order on the US President and Vice President variable. That's all we did. The idea of this is that if we then plot the data, our plot theoretically should be all the way up straight. Oh, it's because this is the governor's race. I do US President, Vice President. This is why we do it. So if we rearrange the factor level, we can put a categorical on the x-axis, and it will be in a nice monotonically increasing, very aesthetically pleasing look. Okay, this is nice, and you'll see why it gets really nice in a minute when we blow this plot. Okay, so we're going to keep building on this.
Can I ask you a couple questions before you move on?
Absolutely.
So the first question is, why is it that you need to put arrange to see it in the like the output?
Yeah. So the reason for that is that we've changed the precinct variable so it now has these different levels, but we actually haven't modified the data in the order of the data. The levels of the factor do not determine how the data are shown. They have a fixed order of their own, which we haven't modified. What arrange does is then modify that to be corresponding to it. It just so happens we'd already had the data alphabetically organized from the beginning. We just never modified that order.
And then the second question I have is, so if we were to use the factory order on like some variable, and let's say like it spanned across a different variable that you wanted to like facet wrap in your ggplot, would that order each of those like graphs by that variable that you've ordered by factor?
So it should actually just be fine. So for instance, I might say, so the nice thing is that because the order is always monotonically increasing, if you pull subsets of it, within those subsets, it will also be monotonically increasing. So I can show, for instance, so facet wrap location here. It's got everything I need. Still monotonically increasing. The thing you'll see is that all the Seattle observations are going to be way up here because they're always going to be higher than the other ones. But yeah, even if they were mixed in, you'd see they're always increasing. So the arrangement of it, so long as you do it before you group or anything like that, it should do the job. Okay. So question here is, can you say again why a range will order the data frame but not the ggplot data points? So this is a funny thing. The thing that determines the order on the plot for categorical variables is the level of the factor that the variable is. So for instance, in my precinct data here, this here, if I plot precinct, by default, what's going to happen is ggplot is going to convert precinct to a factor. And if you make a variable into a factor and you don't tell it how to level it, it's just going to put them in alphabetical order. So our original plot was in alphabetical order. What we've done here is we've converted it to a factor and then said, I don't want it in alphabetical order. Instead, I want these levels to be in the ascending order of our US president and vice president column. And because this ends up being a factor when it gets to ggplot here, ggplot arranges the x-axis in the factor level order instead of alphabetical. And so this is one of these like things that seem strange and finicky about it, but it's actually a powerful thing because it means you're never stuck with alphabetical order, but you're also not stuck with caring about the order that your rows and your data are in. Instead, you just change the factor levels. Yeah, and these factor levels also are the order of like dummy variables that will be created in a regression model. Whatever one is the first level is what's the reference level. This will be important later in some certain types of models you might do in stats. Okay. Yeah, factors are annoying. My recommendation is I keep everything character unless I actually want the levels in a specific order, but then I do this. Okay. Okay. So yeah, what's going to happen is if you give a character variable to ggplot, it's actually converting it to a factor before it generates the plot because, yeah, that's what almost everything's actually doing that in R. Character data can't be handled natively by like anything, so it just turns it all into factors. Models do the same thing. But if I ran, for instance, if I run to after the mutate command right here, by then it's been turned into a factor. It's probably hard to see because the text is tiny. But yeah, as soon as I did this FCT reorder, it converted to a factor.
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing we want to do, and I don't mind these questions at all. We're basically at the end of this homework. So, you know, don't feel bad about stopping me for this kind of stuff. It's important. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, right? If I look at this plot, I'm going to remove my facet here. Look at this thing. Okay. We want to get rid of these like labels down here because we're going to get sort of a mess in our final plot. What we can do is you can actually just say, we can take scale x discrete breaks equals null. You can take this right here, add it on, and it deletes that x-axis. We don't actually care about the specific precincts. We can just get rid of it that way. Okay. So there's another thing we want to do, though. I'm going to really quickly sort of comment this out. Control-Shift-C will comment multiple lines if you have them highlighted, in case you want to know that. So the thing is what we want to do. We need our data arranged such that we could plot all three races, US President, Vice President, Governor, and Lieutenant Governor at the same time on our ggplot. Okay. What type of data does ggplot like? So if I wanted to make 3 lines on a, yes, it likes long data. So what kind of data structure is it going to want to see from this? If I want to make 3 lines, a line for governor, a line for lieutenant governor, a line for US president, vice president, how would it like those data to be arranged? Does it like them being in 3 columns? How many columns should I have? should have one column for the numeric values. And then I should also have one column for the race, right? And so that's correct there. One row for each precinct race combination. So if I want to take my data that look like this and flip them into one precinct row, what command should I use? How do we do that? Not exactly narrower, but it's a basic idea. It's pivot, and then as soon as I start typing it, if you forget the answer to something like this, you start typing and you'll find it's pivot longer. Okay. The way to remember it is the types of data in the general sort of colloquial terms for them are wide data and long data. So you pivot wide and you pivot long. Hopefully that'll help you remember. I usually just start typing and then hit tab when the thing I want pops up. Okay, so if we want to pivot longer, we might look and at pivot longer and be like, well, how am I going to go about doing this? So pivot longer takes a whole load of arguments, right? Which ones in particular do we want, right? We are going to be taking a bunch of different columns and pivoting them out longer. There's a couple different ways we can do this. Does anybody have an idea for ways we could do this? We could say governor through whatever variable. For instance, we could say, I'm going to start with governor through, this case, I guess actually we want registered voters all the way through turnout. So we could say go all the way through turnout, pivot that. And then I think technically, you don't even have to do anything else. I could just say pivot that. It's going to put all those in a name, all those in a value. We could do it like that if we wanted to, but we probably actually want to leave some of these other things off or something. In this case, we actually really only care about the precinct and those three races. So one of the easier things to do might be to get rid of the extraneous variables we don't want. But this syntax will generally work. So in this case, if I say, let's go through not turnout, but governor, do I have president or US vice president? Watch what we get. Okay. We're going to get Adair, not Seattle, right? 3, these are all duplicated because the turnout rate, the times counted, and the registered voters are the same, right, for each one of these. But what actually varies is governor, lieutenant governor, US president, vice president, and a value for each of those. Okay, so it's smart enough to figure out that we don't care about repeating values of these other things and leave them alone, and do that. Okay, any questions about that? There's other syntax I could use for this too. I could say I don't want to pivot other variables, but this is probably the easiest way to do it. Let's pivot these 3. I could, if I want, specify the variable names I want these to go to. I could say, for instance, race values 2 equals something like that. That will just rename the race Democratic support columns. Can do that. Questions about that? Okay, we got nothing. So we're just about there. So the last thing I want to do, right, is I want to make a line plot where the horizontal axis is the precincts, the vertical axis is Democratic support, and the 3 lines should be in different colors, 1 color for each race of interest. So I've got something like this. I'm going to empty out this. What should I have inside this AES? What do I want on my x-axis? What do I want on my y-axis? What else do I want? Give any one of them or any component of this. What's going on my x-axis? Exactly. We went through all that effort reordering precinct. So precinct is what we want in the X. Now, what do we want on the y-axis? So we want those actual like Democratic vote percentages. Where are those coming from now? Exactly. We made this new Democratic support column. So if I show you this, all right, instead of being in governor, lieutenant governor, and president, right, it's now in a single Democratic support column. Say Democratic support. Okay. So I need one other component in here. If I want a different color for each one of these races, what should I say? Yeah, right. Well, if I want a different color, I'm going to use color. If I want a different color for each race, I'm going to say race. Okay. This ought to give me. Oh, I gotta type that into there. Okay. So what am I missing now? What do we want to be shown on the plot? We want a geom line. Tack that in right here. Geom line. Okay. Now we have a problem. It says each group consists of only one observation. Do you need to adjust the group aesthetic? Okay. So what do we want these data grouped on here? So this is a funny ggplot thing. Is it's assumed that we want these grouped on something other than what we actually want them on. If you want to force grouping data, do you remember what we use? We want to make sure our data are grouped on what? What does grouping determine? So grouping determines, for instance, how it draws the lines and things like that. So how do we do that? Now, the thing is, this is a funny thing. Group by won't help us here. Group by is sort of a dplyr way to do summarizing things, but how do we group things within a ggplot? Yeah, it's a group. So I guess group, and what do we want to group on? What do we want one line per? Per race. Okay. No error message. And now we get this plot. Okay. So what this is showing right here is the US president and vice president race line is the nice smooth line here, the always increasing line going through the middle of all of this. Because we ordered our data that way, so the x-axis is ordered on it, it's going to be nice and smoothly increasing. But what you're seeing here is the lieutenant governor and lieutenant governor and governor's races trend differently up and down around this line. A place that has a higher vote for US president and vice president sort of on average has a higher governor, lieutenant governor Democratic vote rate, but they don't trend on it perfectly. Okay. So if you looked at a plot like this, what would you say in general about like the governor versus the US president and vice presidential candidate? So how does this line for US president, vice president sort of on average compare to, say, the orange line, right? Yeah, the blue line is almost always higher. So on average, the governor here appears to be in generally less popular than the presidential candidate was throughout most of these precincts. The lieutenant governor is tracking it a little bit, maybe a little bit closer. This is something that happens right when you have a sort of polarizing candidate. You know, if you remember back to 2016, there may have been a slightly polarizing candidate involved. And this will cause things like the vote to be much or substantially higher for one of the candidates for one party than the other when they're going against the polarizing candidate. Okay? So something to look at. Some traumatic 2016 data. What you were doing then. So, okay. This is basically the idea I have for the plot here. You might dress it up very slightly, but this is sort of the gist of it. This is a nice, pretty plot of a type you might want to see for data of this kind in the future. Maybe you have some sort of, categorical data, but you want to, present it in some meaningful way, not just in alphabetical order. This gives you sort of a toolbox to work with those sorts of things. Okay. And that's about all I'm really expecting on this one. You might dress it up in some other ways, shift some stuff around, do what you want. But yeah, another thing you could do, for instance, is, you could look at a scatter plot with a mean line through it or something like that. You do whatever you want, but that's basically what I got. Anybody have any questions about any of this?
Can you explain again why you use the group in the aesthetics?
Yeah, so this is sort of a funny thing. So if I take out group race right here, and it says, geom path, each group consists of only one observation. You need to adjust the group aesthetic. Now, the thing about this is that normally when we do something like geom line, it picks up that we want one line per color, usually if we specify color. But there's something about throwing a factor on your X or your Y axis that sets that to be the group. So the reason there's only one observation per group is because it set this precinct variable defaulting to group, because ggplot's trying to be smart, okay? But in this moment, it's being stupid and annoying. So instead, we need to manually override it and say, no. I actually want to be grouping on race instead. It's just a finicky thing. Okay. So here's a question. Can we SCT reorder lieutenant governor and governor? We absolutely could, but the thing is we can only order on one race at a time. The thing is that it doesn't make any sense to reorder. So you can't reorder simultaneously for US president or lieutenant governor because you'd have two different precincts occupying the same location. So you wouldn't be comparing the observations against each other. Well, you could reorder the data to your heart's content and you'll get a slightly different looking plot. But you got to pick one of them because we're reordering the precinct. And so you can only order a single value of precinct on one variable.
I have one more question. Sorry, I'm asking.
Yeah. Oh, that was great.
So last week's homework, I was just a little bit confused on aside from what we did in lab, what was the icing on top that we had to do for submission.
Mm-hmm.
Have to comment our code basically, or comment what's happening in each chunk below it.
Just, a little bit at most, only where it's kind of asked for. It'd be more so the thing is in these kind of homeworks, we're really going through most of it. In that case, we didn't do any plotting or anything like that, so you don't kind of dress much up. It would really just be places where I'm saying describe something. So if we go back up to the the previous one up here. So this would be something here, in fact, I've done a bunch of write up here and I'm just saying, we see this. I'm doing a lot more write up here than I expect you all to do. It's more the things that I would want you to say something is where it's specifically kind of asked for, do you see something funny? Does something look off here? Like that. But I honestly don't really need too much. It's if you want to say something, you want to comment your code, you want to test things, it's kind of nice to include something if you create a data frame like this, maybe create a little bit of a display or something like that. You can just display it a little bit to show that you kind of did it. But, honestly, I'm just looking for the code works and runs and does the things it's supposed to. The only things I care too much about are dressing up, making the plots look nice and stuff, because I think it's sort of important to get used to making nice looking, graphics.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So there's a question here is, where does the column governor come from? I did not have this column in my data frame. No, you did not. We generated it way up here. So we got, so we had, for instance, this democratic vote rates data frame we generated, which was done sort of after number 3 up here. Basically what we did is we went down to the rows that have the democratic votes. We calculated some rates for them, ended up with a data frame like this. So we have precinct race observations with Democrat support. And then what we did is we pivoted these data out. So we have this data frame, Democrat vote rates, 1 row per precinct race. But then we said, I want to take the race column and make each value of this into a new column. So names from race and values from Democratic support, which pivots our data out to have a governor column, a lieutenant governor column, and a US president and vice president column. So we've generated it from this race column. Okay. That makes sense? Or was that gibberish? Great. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I have a question, but I don't know how applicable it'll be for other people.
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so back like last week, I'm a little confused because when we were in question 1 today, and we created the total candidate votes, we took candidate votes grouped by precinct race, and when we have summarized total votes and sum of count, like, so when I go back to the object we made last week with like I used king relevant race or whatever,
yeah,
I didn't have a total votes. And so then when I went to do this piece, like it said, you know, total votes not found.
So you should have, so at the end of this one right here, you should have 2 objects. You should have a turnout rates one like this.
Yeah.
But you also should have something, probably king relevant races is probably your like that kind of looks like this, right?
Yeah, but mine is only like Seattle precinct. So that's why I was confused too. I was like, I don't know why this isn't showing all my precincts.
So what probably happened was I did a couple of sort of examples testing it where I filtered out the Seattle or non-Seattle ones to show that it was working, but I deleted that filter code. So most likely you probably still have that filter code in, which is my bad for not explaining to make sure to remove it. So it's probably this right here, except with a filter statement after it, like king relevant races, create a location, and then as an example, I filtered out afterwards.
Okay.
That's probably where that came from.
Okay. Okay, but then still like in the total vote or in total candidate votes, like I don't have total votes. So I'm confused as to which like object that's coming from.
Okay, so it's being created right here. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with king flag here is essentially the king relevant race one from earlier. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, if we want to get the total number of votes for candidates people could actually vote for, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take king flag here and notice that for legitimate candidates, they can either be like, basically the no party ones are not legitimate candidates. So I'm going to filter out no party, except for the case where they're write-ins. Write-ins are a legitimate candidate. So I say here, filter out all the NPs except the ones that are write-ins. And this gives me candidate vote rows, which is a data frame that should have about 3 rows per like governor, lieutenant governor, but more for president and vice president. And then what I'm going to do is sum up the sum of count column to get the total number of legitimate votes cast for the candidates.
Okay.
So to do that, I'll say, take this candidate vote rows, group it by the precinct and the race, and then summarize create total votes is equal to the sum of count column. So this is where it's coming from.
Okay.
Run that, and then it should give me something that looks like this. 1 precinct race with a total number of votes cast in that race.
Okay.
Does that do the job for you?
I have to look back and figure out where my king like relevant race data got messed up, but yeah.
What do they look like?
They look like like my precinct is only the Seattle precinct.
Okay, yeah, so
So
that's most likely right up here. Yeah, probably here where I created. So I started with like king relevant races, whatever, and where you created the Seattle variable, so the location or whatever you called it variable. If you go and find that, most likely there's a filter statement attached to it or right after it.
Yeah, that says like location equals.
Yeah, get rid of that.
Okay.
It should be good.
Okay.
So there's a question in chat. Does group by precinct race equal group by race precinct? Yeah, basically, because it's going to create one group for each unique combination of those two, so it should be symmetrical either way. The only difference comes with one you summarize. It's going to keep the grouping based on the first one. Yeah. So it'll be the same if you ungroup afterwards. Is there time to clarify group on group once the other questions to check out? Yeah, I can do that again. Yeah. Since somebody's asking, I'll just do it again right now. So I had a little code right here to kind of give an example. So if I take for instance, the MT cars data set, simple little example data of a bunch of Motor Trend cars, I'm going to group on the number of cylinders in the engines. If I group on this and summarize down, so I'm saying here the average miles per gallon is equal to the mean of miles per gallon. What it's going to say here is summarize by default ungrouping the output. So this says I've taken MT cars, I've grouped it by cylinder, I run summarize, and it's going to ungroup my output. So all the grouping is gone. I look in this data frame, it doesn't say anything about groups down here, it's not grouped. The reason for that is I'm only summarizing over one variable. And because there's only going to be, because I'm summarizing one row per level of cylinder, there's no reason to preserve any groups. But if I instead say, I want to group on two variables, automatic transmission and cylinder, it's going to say something different. Summarize is regrouping output by AM. It's regrouping by the first one of the variables in the group by, because there's no longer only one row per like cylinder, but there is one row per sort of combination of AM and cylinder. So what it's done here is it's left the group on AM. So these data are grouped. That's all the levels of AM. These data are grouped here. It's grouped on whatever is the first variable here. If you don't want that, you can say dot groups equals, actually I have to double check. Dot groups equals drop, for instance, we'll leave no groups. You'll see here in this one, it subtly says a tibble, if you display it and it has groups, will add a row here saying the groups are equal to this. So this is saying it's grouped on the AM variable, and there's two different groups because there's two levels of AM. Okay. But
that's really handy to be able to read the output. Thank you.
Yeah. If I do dot groups equals drop, it doesn't group them anymore. And also here you can see if I group on AM and cylinder, and before I do the summarize, it shows that there's groups. It's grouped on AM and cylinder, and there's 6 combinations of AM and cylinder. So you can kind of see when the data are grouped, but it's kind of subtle. Like it's really easy to miss this little thing the tibbles add.
Yeah. So is there a particular reason why people use groups like this going forward with their data? Like why they would want it to stay that way? So
this is sort of like, to me, I never do usually. So I'm basically always ungrouping things. But my understanding is that there's a sort of a preference to, like, for instance, like group by, summarize on these, and then continue doing operations within AM. And there's just sort of an expectation if that's how they behave. I don't know why exactly. It might be some kind of behavior borrowing from like SQL or something like that, but it's a default behavior. There's usually a good reason for it, but I'm not sure in this case what it is.
Okay, thanks. Do you mind copying and pasting that in the chat? I was just going to play around with it a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
Can I ask one quick question?
Absolutely.
So the groups equal drop has the similar function with ungroup?
Yes, it does exactly the same thing.
Thanks.
Yeah, so that'd be the same as piping into ungroup there. Yeah, same deal. It's just that you can also give it other options. Like for instance, you could say dot groups equals keep, and keep would not even drop cylinder. So now the data is still grouped on AM and cylinder. I have no idea why you want that, but it has it. So you've got lots of options for this. Yeah.
That's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else got anything? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll let you all think for a minute before I disappear anyway. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Chuck, one more question.
Nope, I figured you might have another one. What you got?
Yeah, I got that back to like all my precincts, but I'm still getting total votes. Yeah, like I'm still getting the same thing where total votes is not found.
So it's saying, is it saying total votes not found?
Well, or it's saying or X object, sum of count not found.
So in this, whatever your version of candidate vote rows is, it doesn't have sum of count in it here.
No, it does.
Is the capitalization right?
Yes.
Do you have a pipe leading into it in both cases here?
Yes.
Can you copy the entire block of code into chat?
Let me look that. Is it in the chat, that chunk?
I don't have this in the chat, but it ought to be. I mean, not about it, not in here. It should be something like that, but it's it kind of depends also on the your data slightly, but
right, because it's, yeah, I don't have. Let's see. Summarize regrouping output by precinct, override with dot group argument.
yep, that's fine.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Mine looks.
Just display the out. If you display the output of it, that means it worked. So you should have something that looks like this.
Yeah, let me just run that. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. I don't know what's wrong with mine.
Okay. Yeah. You most likely just need to rerun the code above, like you probably had like the filtered or whatever. Just rerun it like that, and should be good now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have any more issues, Slack channel or email.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool
Have a
beans.
good night.
Too.